After a fairly active start to free agency, things really slowed down for the Jets on day two. Is this part of a broader strategy by Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji? Let's explore today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, March 12th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday we try and do a mailbag with listener questions. And because the Jets were so quiet in free agency on Tuesday, we can do a mailbag today. So thanks. Let's begin our first question. Why do you think the Jets have made so few free agent signings to this point? Is it because they're limited by the cap until Rodgers and others are cut, or are they just getting beaten out for players by other teams? And that's a very good question. It's amazing the difference a day makes, because day one was pretty active for the Jets. You know, they signed Justin Fields. They got their quarterback. And, you know, through the lead up to the offseason, that was the big question following this team. Who was going to play quarterback for them in 2025? And within a few hours of free agency starting, we got our answer. It's going to be Justin Fields, who will be the Jets starting quarterback. Jets also, made a few other moves. They signed Brandon Stevens, a cornerback from the Baltimore Ravens. They got a safety, Andre Cisco, from the Jacksonville Jaguars. And then day two comes, and there's not really a lot going on. Jets lose Ashton Davis to the Miami Dolphins. That's no big loss. Jets lose Solomon Thomas to the Dallas Cowboys. That's like less than no big loss. I mean, all these defensive tackles who did nothing with the Jets last year are changing teams. I think there are a couple things going into this. Now, I don't think Rodgers has anything to do with it, because it sounds like we may get clarity on this sooner rather than later, but it sounds like the Jets are leaning towards making Rodgers a post-June 1st cut. And if that happens, Rodgers' cap hit is actually going to be exactly what it would have been if he was on the team. So Rodgers' cap hit, if he stayed with the team, would have been $23 million. But if the Jets make Rodgers a post-June 1st cut, his cap hit remains $23 million. So it doesn't impact the cap. That changes on June 1st. On June 1st, his cap hit actually goes down to $14 million, and then the Jets would take on a dead money hit of $35 million next year. But I don't think it's because they're waiting to cut Rodgers, because if they cut Rodgers and they designate him a post-June 1st cut like everyone's expecting, then his cap number actually doesn't change until June 1st. Now it gets lower after June 1st. That doesn't really impact free agency, because while there will be some free agents out there to be signed on June 1st, most of the guys are going to sign over the next couple of weeks. But I do think, look, the lack of cap space does have an impact. And you can maneuver like your arguments any way you want. I mean, I saw a couple of people pointing out, well, hey, the Jets are top 10 in cap space. I guess their cap situation is pretty good. Well, you have to consider how many needs they had. You look, I mean, across the roster, they had needs. They had to get a quarterback. They got one. Probably need two starting receivers, need a right tackle, need a tight end, because Tyler Conklin's a free agent, probably not coming back. Defensive side of the ball, you probably need at least a rotational defensive end. You need multiple defensive tackles. And you needed to figure out the Jamie Sherwood situation, which you did. You needed to figure out the number 2 corner, which you did. You needed to figure out safety, which you did. So, there's not a lot of money to go around. And look, one of the things that I will say is I'm not terribly upset that the Jets kept a relatively low profile the first couple of days of free agency, because one thing I've been saying since this podcast began airing is the biggest mistakes many teams make happen on the first couple of days of free agency. I mean, this is the way you think. This is the way I think about it. I think it's pretty basic. If you're a free agent in the NFL, you are like really making a life-altering decision. You have to figure out what team you're going to play for. This could be like the move that defines your career. A lot of guys don't get a second chance to sign a big contract. This is like your life-changing move. So you got to think about, like, what team do I want to fulfill my legacy with? And then there are like the more basic day-to-day things. What city do I want to live in? If I have a family, where do I want to put my kids in school? So, with facing a decision this big, for a lot of guys, I know the way I would approach it is I'd want to at least take a couple days to think about it. And even then, a couple days probably is not like ideal, but at least then you have some time to think about it. I think that's a pretty logical way to expect players to approach things. So if you take that mindset, and like, players are human, I think sometimes we forget that. You want to take a couple days to think this stuff through. So if I'm going to bypass just taking like 48, 72 hours to think through where I want to play, it's probably because some team has given me such a ridiculously big contract that I don't even need to think about it. I'm just going to take the contract because nobody could possibly match this. Nobody could possibly beat the contract. If I'm going to bypass like taking some time to actually consider my options, that's probably what's happened. And more often than not, when you get one of those deals, it ends up being a mistake. It ends up being something the team regrets. So, and I gotta be honest with you, like, you look at what the Jets have done to this point. One of the things I don't like is it's not that they've been so quiet. It's that I really am not a huge fan of the Brandon Stevens contract. The other contracts I'm okay with. Some of them I even like. Like, I like the Sherwood move. I like the Cisco move, that bringing in the Jacksonville safety. Those I think are pretty solid moves. But if I had to complain about what the Jets have done so far, I don't think it would be the lack of activity. I think it would be the Brandon Stevens signing, because I just think they overpaid him. So I think that, look, this you need to understand as well that given the Jets cap situation, there simply was no way they were going to be able to address every single need that they had. I just don't think that was a very realistic hope. I think, look, a year from now, if the Jets handle this offseason well, they'll have plenty of money to spend. They will be able to address a lot of their core needs. But we spent 2 years being all in with Aaron Rodgers. Well, being all in with Aaron Rodgers means that you were borrowing resources from 2025 because you were trying to get the Jets as functioning at as high of a level as you could in 2023 and 2024. And as we know, the Jets did not do a great job with those resources. But so a couple elements at play here. I mean, you also have to consider there are still plenty of good players available, and many times the teams that win free agency in the end, they're not the teams that get credit for winning free agency in March. In March, the teams that make the splashiest move get the credits from the publications like ESPN, from NFL Network. But but typically the best signings are the ones that kind of go under the radar. And then you only appreciate them when the games begin, and you realize that some team got a guy on a really favorable bargain contract. So look, Darren Muji and Aaron Glenn are not, they're probably not going to be judged by this, these 2 days. They'll be judged over a longer term, and it's also about not just making the obvious moves. It's about finding the quality under the radar guys. That here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll keep talking about Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji very early in their tenure. And again, we can't really judge them all that much, but have they given us any indications about how they want to run the team? I think the answer is yes. I think that there's a very subtle shift from what we saw under Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh. And I'll explain what that shift is as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Taking care of your mental health can feel like a big investment, but it's just as important as taking care of your body. Traditional in-person therapy can cost anywhere from $100 to $250 per session, but with BetterHelp, you can save up to 50% per session. BetterHelp offers a flat fee for weekly online therapy sessions, making professional support more accessible and affordable. With over 30,000 therapists and over 5 million people helped, it's the world's largest online therapy platform. We spend money on gym memberships and healthy food. Why not invest in our mental health too? Your well-being is worth it. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Our next question comes from Eric. John, based on an admittedly small sample size, do you get a sense of the vision and philosophy of the Jets' new front office and how they're approaching building this team, or is it too early to tell? Well, I think for the most part, it's too early to tell. I mean, I don't have a sense for how they're going to handle the salary cap. There's a lot I don't have a sense on it at the moment because, we've only seen, 4 major signings at this point, re-signing Sherwood, bringing in Fields, bringing in Stevens, bringing in Cisco. So, it's still too early to say. I do think there is one thing that sticks out, and it's something I was expecting based on Aaron Glenn's scheme. And that is that the focus on the defensive side of the ball is now about investing in the secondary. And that is a stark shift from what we saw under Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh. With Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh, it was all about the defensive line was the number one priority. And both of these make sense when you think about the schemes that the respective defensive coaches ran. And this is not like a Glenn's better than Saleh or Saleh is better than Glenn type of thing, because this is really kind of a neutral type of thing. It's really just a philosophical thing. But Saleh liked to rush 4 guys and play 7 guys in coverage. So if you think about that, that means your coverage, the strength of your scheme is going to be in its coverage. You're going to essentially have 7 guys in coverage against 5 receivers. So that's good for the defense. Where it leaves you at a disadvantage is up front. It means you have 4 pass rushers versus 5 offensive linemen. So, the way Saleh helped to mitigate that was investing in quality defensive linemen, because you're going to be outnumbered with your pass rush. You're only going to go 4 on 5. So if you're going 4 on 5, you need really talented guys. And the Jets took that a step further under Saleh. They tried to get as many talented defensive linemen as possible so that they could rotate in through the games. That way, if somebody needed a rest, you were not necessarily getting a much lower quality rep from your defensive linemen. And it worked quite well through much of Saleh's tenure. Glenn likes to blitz more, and that means more man-to-man coverage. So you think about it, if you're blitzing more, that means your pass rushers have more help. That means the numbers are more on your side. But man-to-man coverage is tougher to play. You have less guys in the back of the defense, which means you don't necessarily need as talented of a pass rush group, because now you're sending more guys at the quarterback. Now you're just you're sending 5 or 6 on every play. So that means nobody's getting double teamed. That means one guy just has to win on one-on-one, which is a lot easier than it is only rushing 4. However, you have less numbers in the back of your defense, which means the guys in the back of your defense really need to lock in. And I think that's the reason I don't think it's an accident that of the 3 players the Jets imported on Monday, the 3 free agents signed from other teams, one was a quarterback, obviously the most important position on the field, and the other 2 play in the defensive secondary. There are other elements to this, of course. I mean, the Jets only had 1 safety on the roster heading into Monday. So that obviously played an impact in their thinking and in their judgment of how they handled things. But, I think it's clear that this is going to be a defense that's much more focused on bringing in quality players in the back end. That they need quality guys in the secondary. And that's because Aaron Glenn wants to blitz more. We've gone from one of the most blitz-averse coaches in the league in Robert Saleh to one of the biggest blitzers in the league in Aaron Glenn. And the way you address personnel will adjust accordingly. Now, of course, we know the Jets also did invest in secondary players when Saleh was here. I mean, the Jets did draft Sauce Gardner 4th overall. They did give DJ Reed a decent contract. And on the same note, the Jets are going to want quality pass rushers in here. This is really a matter of degrees, where the number 1 priority went from defensive line to secondary. That does not mean the Jets just ignored secondary in the past. It does not mean that they'll ignore defensive line going forward. It just means that the number 1 priority has shifted. And that's really what you can say right now. I think everything else is way too early. You really be guessing, but I think the one thing you can say, and it's based on the scheme he's run, it's based on what we were expecting, and it's based on what the Jets have done. That's the one thing I could say that, there's clearly a tangible change right here. Our next question, and it's about the offensive line. John, with Fields in the fold, I believe the Jets will be a run-first team, seeing as they're loaded with talented runners in both quarterback and running back. However, with Morgan Moses departing, it leaves a gaping hole on the offensive line. Does Will Campbell move up to the top of the board? With Fashanu, Simpson, Tippmann, AVT, and Campbell across the line, and Fields, Hall, Allen, and Davis in the run game, this would be something fun to watch. Interesting question, and you got to be careful with what I'm about to do, because just because Aaron Glenn came from Detroit doesn't mean that he's going to run things the exact same way Dan Campbell did when he started in Detroit. You can't say that. But one thing that is notable is that when Dan Campbell was hired, the Lions immediately drafted Penei Sewell, and they drafted him to play right tackle. And the reason that's significant is there's a debate in the NFL, and I think it's a debate that's quickly becoming outdated. But there's a question: is right tackle really a premium position? And you could go, this is one of those history of the league type things. I think I actually mentioned this recently, but up until the 1980s, the 5 offensive line spots were generally viewed as interchangeable. The skills you needed to play center weren't that different from right guard or left tackle. But that changed in the 1980s with Lawrence Taylor. He was a destructive force. And coaches like Bill Walsh realized that they needed to put their best offensive lineman at left tackle so that he'd be the one blocking Lawrence Taylor. Well, eventually every team wanted a great left tackle. Defensive coordinators adjusted, and they said, well, if the teams are investing in the left tackle position, I should put my best pass rusher against the right tackle because he's not going to be as good. Well, we went through a cycle there, and eventually what happened was teams realized, well, you know what? If the other team's best pass rusher is going up against the right tackle, we better be good at left tackle, and we better be good at right tackle. We better be good at both spots. So, I mean, I think that there's an argument to be made for drafting an offensive lineman. And, I think that, and, I don't want to be like one of those like old people that like, is like shaking my fist at like the fantasy football players. But I do feel like we've gotten to a point where maybe fantasy football has led to a decreased appreciation for how important it is to win in the trenches, because football is still a game of physicality. And everybody's always focused on the play. And like, I'll admit it, like, I think playmakers are really important, but we can't lose track of the trenches. It's critical. And, there really are not that many great options for the Jets at right guard. So I do think Will Campbell has to be an option. And I think you can justify drafting a guy in the top 10 and playing him at right tackle. One other thing I will say is it's only a matter of time before I mix up Will Campbell and Will Johnson on this show. Will Johnson is viewed as the number one corner prospect. Campbell's viewed as the number one offensive line prospect at the tackle position. Both named Will. You can just wait for the guy emailing me saying, "You fool, you mixed the two of them up." I can guarantee you that's going to happen. But yeah, we haven't really talked much about Campbell as a potential pick to the Jets, and I think part of that might be the Jets drafted Olu Fashanu in the first round last year, and there aren't a lot of teams that would go tackle back to back high in the first round. But that doesn't make it a bad decision. I think the idea of building a great offensive line, really investing in the line, it's a good idea. And look, Joe Douglas had a lot of failures with his Jets GM. I think that we know that, in a lot of ways he did not live up to the hype. But the one thing I'll say for Joe Douglas, which was not true of his two predecessors, Mike McCackton and John Idzik, Joe Douglas at least did appreciate how important the offensive line was. He may not have been great at building an offensive line. Well, last year he kind of figured it out. The offensive line last year was actually pretty decent, but there's nothing wrong. It's not even that there's nothing wrong with investing in the offensive line. It's critical to invest in the offensive line. It's critical to get good players there. I would not object to the Jets going offensive line again in the first round because it's that important. And if you build a great offensive line, it can mean big things for your team. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about another critical position. It's a position where the Jets are weak. Wide receiver. Are there any good options to put behind Garrett Wilson? No. So what can be done? Jets may need to go with some familiar veteran names, and we'll talk about who those names may be as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Because right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, and even who's cutting down the nets. You may have your eye on a few underdogs this year, and FanDuel will make it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. With tournament games happening almost every day, there's always something to bet on. The FanDuel app is simple to use. When you win, you get paid instantly, no waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag. Our next question comes from Taylor. John, I'm cautiously optimistic about Justin Fields. I think I would be more excited if we had any kind of receiving core. Given that all the big names have been signed, do you think there are any remaining good options for the Jets to add to their receiving depth, short of praying that Ted McMillan falls to us at 7? And yeah, it's tough. Now, the one thing I will say, Taylor, is we've had these discussions a lot in the past prior to 2022 where we did not have a legitimate number one receiver. So we've got a legitimate number one receiver now. So that's a real positive thing. And look, there are worse guys to build around than Garrett Wilson. The challenge is that we don't have much behind Garrett Wilson. And, Ted McMillan could be there at 7. But, I don't think you want to go into the draft feeling like you need to draft Ted McMillan. I feel like you don't want to go in with what you got right now. Because you go in with what you got right now, you're going to feel pressure to draft a receiver. And that creates all kinds of problems. Because first of all, what if Ted McMillan doesn't fall to 7? Second, what if there's like an even better player that falls to 7 and you feel like you can't draft him now because you need a receiver? So you don't want to go into the draft being desperate at the wide receiver position. Unfortunately for the Jets, I don't know that there's another option than just like gambling on like a veteran, hoping you can find like a veteran in his maybe 30s who maybe you just try and squeeze another year out of. So, maybe is that Amari Cooper. Now, if you're a long time listener to the show, 3 years ago, I felt like the Jets should have traded for him because the Jets would have had to give him a 5 and he would have really helped out Zach Wilson. I don't know if Zach Wilson would have succeeded, but you put Amari Cooper and Garrett Wilson together in 2022, it makes a big difference. You put them together in 2025, Garrett Wilson's going to be really good. Amari Cooper's coming off a bad year. He's in his 30s. It's tough, but there's rumors Cooper Kupp. I would not trade for Cooper Kupp. The Rams may try and trade for Cooper Kupp, but at the time when we're recording this podcast, there has been no trade yet. But there's talk the Rams may release him. I mean, Keenan Allen's really up there in years. Can you try and squeeze another year out of him? I think that might be your best bet. And these aren't great bets, but you got to bring somebody in who knows how to run a route. I think that's the key. It's like you got to get a receiver in here who like knows how to like handle things professionally. Because if you're going to run Xavier Gipson and Malachi Corley out there, I think you're going to have real problems. And you're just going to have to try and find the best guy at the end of his career, and just hope things pan out there. But there really are no great options that I see. Unless somebody becomes available again, unless another DK Metcalf caliber receiver wants out of wherever he is, and that's possible because you look at some of the free agent contracts that are being given out in the NFL, and this is a direct result of the new TV deal. The new TV deal is kicked into effect, and the salary cap is based on the league's revenues. And the revenues have gone way up because of the new TV deal. So a lot of there might be somebody who's unhappy with his current contract, and maybe his team doesn't want to play ball, and maybe that's a situation where the Jets can jump in, but. Yeah, there are no easy options because the thing is, everybody needs a receiver. The Jets aren't the only team out there looking for wide receiver help. The good news, again, is that we actually are starting from a place where we got Garrett Wilson. So that's a real quality, that's a real quality place to start. Next question, who are some of the bargain second-wave free agents still on the market that you would like to see the Jets target at the time of the recording, since things can change quickly? And thank you for that disclaimer because, some of these podcast episodes don't age all that well because things can change wildly in the span of a couple of minutes. But at the time we're recording this podcast, and part of the challenge is like you need to know who the bottom of the market's going to fall out on. So that's a real challenge. That's not the easiest thing in the world to figure out. But there are a couple of guys I have my eye on, and will the bottom fall out on them? I don't know that for a fact, but I do think there are some interesting players out there. So, one guy I'll give you, I think that there's a good interior type defensive lineman from the Los Angeles Chargers, who's not a spectacular guy, but kind of a rotational player who I think he's a good good run defender, pretty decent pass rusher, Tierra Tarts. So that'd be one guy I have my eye on. There's another guy who I've had my eye on, Julian Blackmon. He's a safety with the Colts. Now, this past year, he kind of had the same role as Andre Sisco in Jacksonville, where he's really more of a deep middle guy. But at other points in his career, he's been a guy who's kind of been the jack of all trades at the safety position. So if you're looking to really boost your safety spot and maybe send Tony Adams to the bench full time, he could be a guy you could bank on. A guy I'm not excited about, but somebody who could conceivably fill a role is Jedrick Wills, who has kind of been banged up. But, he's been banged up the last couple of years. But the thing is, that could drop his salary. And, he showed some signs of success. He showed some signs of being able to play early in his career. And, I look at offensive linemen across the league, and a lot of them, offensive line's a spot where, players aren't really trained in college anymore. But I think this goes to some of the rules in the college game. In the college game, you don't get called for being an ineligible lineman down the field until you're 3 yards past the line of scrimmage, and it's only 1 yard in the NFL. So that difference has a big role in the way college offenses are run. You ever hear about like a gimmicky college offense? It's in part because of that rule. Because offensive linemen can go 3 yards down the field without being considered ineligible receivers downfield, you can run a lot more screens. and you can get a lot more diverse with your screen usage. But that means you're not training your offensive linemen to like figure out how to block in the drop back passing game. In the NFL, when you can only go 1 yard down the field, you can't run the screen as much. So you guys need to be able to block in the drop back passing game. So one thing you do see in the NFL these days is players sometimes it takes them 4 or 5 years to really learn their craft because they aren't being trained the way they used to in college. So I see a guy like Jedrick Wills, who was very highly touted when he came out and had a couple decent seasons, early in his career. And the last couple of years haven't been gone that well, and he's been a little banged up. I mean, maybe he's a guy, if the market falls out on him, that's worth a shot at right tackle, because there really aren't a lot of great options at right tackle. If you're looking around, there are certain positions where you just have to draft and develop guys, because anybody who's good is going to be signed. There are certain premium positions where everybody needs somebody, so which makes it very tough to find quality players in free agency, because teams know that they won't, if they let a quality guy at the premium positions go, they won't be able to replace him. So it creates a very difficult situation. But those are a couple names I have my eye on. Now, will the market fall out on them? It's still a little early to say. We're only in day 3 of free agency, but those would be the guys I'd speculate a little bit about right now. Maybe they'll be available for a reasonable price. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.